So this move white played was described as a computer-like move, although this is just, it's not really. Rook takes g7, and then black was planning rook a2 check, and then just keep checking with that rook. And then after king h3, the idea is not to go king f3 now, because then white is in time to check that king away. But the idea is to go rook a1 first. And then we have this idea of king f3 threatening mate. And if the king goes back, then we have perpetual check. Just keep checking on. So Caruana was playing for a draw here. So that actually is a draw. He won. So there's no way white can escape this, because you have to get rid of this pawn first. And so it doesn't really work. And this is just perpetual. So what white does is, yeah, we would like to take g7. But before we do that, we just disturb black a little bit. So rook e7 check. That's the intermediate move. And then rook takes g7. And the move was described as this, you know, chess engine-like move, superhuman move. But it's actually just what makes the Rook Endgames hard. So it's not like a computer move or anything. It's just, that is just what makes Rook Endgames hard. That's just how it is. So let's see quickly, rook e7. So now black doesn't have this perpetual idea. And this pawn on h5 is doomed. So black has some counterplay with that a pawn. Let's say after it moves to a2, white king has to hide. Otherwise, but this is a win for white, and this is how Carlsen won the game. So there was no way. White is just pushing up the board, and then it's threatening checkmate or promotion. So the king will get to g6. So this is winning for white. So let's try to go back to the beginning, because Caruana, he played king takes e4, and maybe he missed this intermediate check, and then rook takes g7. So what he could have done is he could have changed the move order. Could have played rook a2 check first. If king goes to f3, then of course we keep checking. So, and then king to h3, and then we can take on e4, because now black can go to f3. And here we have the same idea of a perpetual check. So rook e7 check, and then rook takes g7. Okay. So let's see the next one. So this is not the puzzle position. I started a few moves back. So it actually started up king takes h4. And now rook is fighting 3 pawns. But in positions like these, it's more important to get the king in, the white king in, than to grab the pawn. And black will usually try to advance 1 pawn quickly instead of trying to advance all 3 pawns. So it's more like a race between 1 black pawn and white's king trying to get in. So king is aiming for e2. So this is kind of a normal race where the king goes to e2, g2. If white is allowed to get in front of the pawn like this, then usually it's good for white. So, and here we have the starting position, I believe. So what is white's move? Yeah, rook f2. So let's try, rook f2 is correct. And so what do you do is, now I have a choice. The king was perfect here. I was trying to keep the white king out. So what do you do if I play king g1? H2, king G3. That thing here with rook versus queen usually doesn't work. But there's a pawn here. That's clever. So this is study-like, because there's an extra pawn on G6. So this is a very good idea. So otherwise, let's see, you have this in-between check. Let's check afterwards. Maybe your idea works because there is this pawn on G6. So this is very clever. Then rook B2. But otherwise, it's the in-between move on G2. We saw it in the presentation as well on the other side of the board. King to the corner, then we have a mate in 2. And king F1 when we just lose the pawn. But let me see, king G3. But I can promote to a knight here, right? And then I just fork your king and rook. So so it has to be rook G2 here. Okay, so that's the solution. If king G1, then you go king F3. So what if I play king to G3? Yeah. And here's the big difference between king there and there, is that now black cannot slip down into the corner. And how do you win now with white? King F2, yeah. Forcing him to move to a knight. And we have seen this so many times, just a waiting move, and white is winning. So yeah, from the beginning, if rook G7, let's say, that's why you needed the king here and not there. Then black is suddenly able to make this stalemate trick work, because there is no king to G3 to unblock the G file. So rook F2 check, intermediate check, is the way to win this. Okay, so the next puzzle, we have king F6. And how can black draw this game? Yeah, I think rook A5 works. Let's see, rook F5, rook A5. What if I play rook H7? King F4. And this is this also works as a defense. So that's so rook A5 works. So another idea is to simply move the king up. Let's say king G4. And then when white plays rook H7, we have this check on A6. So here's the idea. If king goes to E7, then of course we check and take the pawn. And if he takes on F7, then we eliminate into this drawn endgame. So we had this defense with rook A6 because white cannot take F7. Okay, so this is what black intended in the game. But by accident, he played king F4 instead of king G4. And then on the way to G, so white wants to play this, but on the way there, he just gave a little intermediate check that was missed by black. This is two strong players. And then rook H7. And now white is winning. So black missed that rook H4 check on the way to H7. And then, so that was the trap in the puzzle. So if you want to play this defense, rook A5 works too. You have to go king G4 on the way to F5. Don't go to F4. So, okay. Another intermediate check. So let's see. What about this one? This is a tricky one. Yep, king B1 is correct. And then after E3, rook a2. So what do you do if I play king b1? King d1, sorry. Yeah, because now we have the opportunity to check the king in and then like this. Okay, so it's great. And if king to d3, then we get the king in. This usually works when we get a king along the first rank. Now the next move will be king d2. So, so even if people get this idea of rook a2, intermediate check, we need to get our king in. I have also seen king b3, but this is wrong. If white has a chance, you should always try to go along the first rank. And it's wrong because black can set up the key position where white's rook is not perfectly placed. So here black can play king d3. And because of this position of the rook, this is going to be a draw. Yeah, rook a8 here. So if white could somehow give a check here now, white would win. And so here we use the same idea as from the key position. The key position was a rook's pawn, but we can still use the same idea of keeping the white king out. It's basically the same idea. But because it's not a rook's pawn, we also have this alternative defense because we have space on the other side. We can go down here. So if king here, queen, so we have this move. So we don't. So so in this position, black has two defenses, but this is a standard one to go this way to keep the white king. Okay, so king b1 and rook a2 is correct. Let's take the next one. So here black is on the way down. G1 is the promotion square. What about this one? Yeah, the magic trick. And we have to do it. Check. King goes somewhere, and then rook g2, and then king f6. And here we actually want two tempos. We got the rook to g2, and the king was actually forced one move back. So, and after this is quite an easy win. We get a key position, like position, let's say that. And now here we can play rook f2 and get our king in. This is just easily winning for white. So we don't have to see that. But if white doesn't make the magic tricky, white needs these two extra tempos to win the game. Otherwise, the white king is simply too slow. So if something like king c7, this is simply too slow. The white king is not able to get in. And the white rook is actually badly placed here on the side. So I just want to show you this idea. So this is a b pawn, or a knight's pawn, not a rook's pawn. So white could try to do something like check. And then let's say something like this. No, maybe not something like this. Let's see. So I wanted to get to a position where something like this. Perhaps black can even play king f5. But in this position, we can also play it like this. Check. And then if white tries something to be clever like this, then promoting to a knight outside of the corner is perfectly viable. So, so I don't know if you had this position in a game before, but first time you see it over the board, it's a little bit scary because the knight is close to the corner, but this is a draw. And the first thing we do is we keep checking until white has to go into this opposite diagonal opposition. And then So basically, we can move back and forth here. We can even move back and forth here under circumstances, or we can try to move the king back and forth. So these are three ideas, and that's why black will never end in Zugzwang here. So for instance, knight a3, we can go back, and white can try to be clever in all kinds of ways, like this. So now we prevent knight from going there, and we cannot play king there. But then we have the third idea. So black has these three ideas. So there will not be Zugzwang. So this is a draw. So it's only in the corner it's a problem. One square away from the corner is always, you can always promote to a knight like this and draw the game. I had this position once against the grandmaster, and it just took me 5 minutes over the game to I knew it was a draw, but you know, getting all the details and everything, it just took a couple of minutes, and then we went on for 50 moves until I claimed a draw. So it's good to know about this endgame. Okay, next one. So yeah, the position of mutual Zugzwang, and there's actually a study by Reti, famous one, based on this position. So in that study by Reti, the rook is here from the beginning, and the solution is to go back to d1. And then we have this position of neutral Zugzwang. So, which is very good to know. So no matter what black does now, then white will go king down the other side. So if black goes to this side, we go to the other side. Let's say here, here. And black is not in time to play king e2. And it's a position of mutual Zugzwang, because if white somehow gets the rook to there, then black is going to attack it after king e3, and it's a draw. So king d7, and white is winning. Same. Yeah, then let's move on. Okay. So this game was played in 1896, actually 2 years before Karstedt came up with this way of defending. So let's see. So that game actually went rook h1. Then black later ended up losing. So how should black defend here? Mm-hmm. See, rook f1. Yeah, so this is this is basic rook endgame theory, but even that is tricky. I mean, you have to study it a couple of times to really understand it. That's what I did. So you can check here, and then you can go on the on the short side with the king, and then white will play the pawn forward here because you cannot prevent it. But then you can jump to the long side with the rook. So the point is you're simply ignoring this pawn, right? So you're not even trying to win a race or trying to use that pawn. You simply give it up, and then you rely on defending a pawn down. So this is a draw. So you're right. You can do that. You can play rook f1 and king f8, go to the short side. Yeah, I think. Let's see. The easiest defense is probably the method by Karstedt 2 years later after this game, which is simply to put the rook behind the pawn. So now we're simply stopping this pawn from entering e6. And because of this idea, and then just wait, because in this situation, let's say now there's no e6. And now white is threatening checkmate, and we will go to the short side. And then let's say check. And now there is simply no e6 because we have king f7. And if check, we go in front of the pawn. So that method by Karstad, which is simply put the rook behind the pawn, this is definitely the easiest way to do it. So if you are in a game and you play like this, it is objectively a draw, but you still have to, suffer. White will try all kinds of trick against you. So getting that pawn, the rook behind the pawn right away is definitely the easier defense. But the key idea is to forget everything about this pawn, which he didn't do in the game, and then he ended up losing. We can try to look at this briefly. So he played rook h1. I don't know, trying to check on the short side, which is wrong. And then this happened. So you see, black is trying the active defense to go into a pawn race, which is just wrong. So he should have made the passive defense, just giving up the pawn. So now he's trying the other way. But this just, if we talk about the key position, which is here, then black is not going to make that. And if king d4, trying to keep the white king out, what do we do here? I would say this is half the magic trick. So we can just play rook b8 here. Yeah. And then the king has to go back, and then we come in. And then you can see that we get to the key position like with white to move. The white is in time to play here. Otherwise, black would have this normal defense of keeping the white king out. So these ideas from the key position are very useful. So this was simply wrong for black trying the active defense. Maybe it was a calculation mistake because it all hang on one move. Or maybe, yeah, in any case, it was wrong. Okay. So this one is probably, I think this one is hard. It's the last one. And the reason why I had this in the puzzle is also to show there are also endgames like this with rook versus two pawns that are just difficult in a different way. So we need to get our king in. But here's the problem. The biggest problem is if white is allowed to change the guard. So king g7 and then move the f pawn forward. So that's always a risk if that happens. So if g7 now, let's say, then black is able to make this defense based on the king is taking care of this pawn and the rook is taking care of that pawn. So here black can just make a waiting move. Let's say this is a draw. And now the black king is useful by attacking f6. But here's the problem is that if you play king d4 first, then I can change the guards. And then suddenly I'm pushing that f pawn and the king is not able to attack the g6 pawn. So yeah, so rook f3. So in these extremely sharp races, sometimes in rook games you have these like waiting moves or slow moves with the rook, which is extremely complicated. But the idea is simply to prevent the white from changing the guards. This is this is another reason why rook games are so complicated. You also see moves like this. Okay, so let's try g7. Then we go back into this defense, and black is okay. If king e6, then we go back to g3. Now we keep this pawn under control. And we are ready to bring our king in. It's the same as before. And here we can just make a waiting move. And so rook f3 is the, and if king e5, then we can do the same, back to g3. And so king e5 is a way to try to keep the black king out. So if I now play f6, how do you draw this with black? Yep. We want to take the pawn, but before that, we just give a little intermediate check. And now this is a draw. And otherwise it's a draw as well, because we can get behind the pawn. And this is winning for white, so that's not good. But rook g5, and then take is a draw. So yeah, it's rook f3 here is it's very difficult. But the idea is simply, once you get that idea, is you need the king in to attack that pawn, the backward pawn there, and you have to prevent the white king from changing guard. That's actually more important than time to bring the black king in. It's actually more important to waste a move, say, to stop the changing of the guard. So, but that you have this extra move in such a sharp position. That's very difficult. Okay, that was all for today. So I hope you liked it. You solved many of the puzzles, so that's great. So so I will follow up by sending out the database. So and I will see you next Sunday. Okay, you're welcome. Bye.